Well, thank you very much, Alexi, and thank you this year as well. Great to be here. It's a real honour, actually, to be following up Charles, who I think we've heard about Costa Nostra briefly, but very much the godfather, I think, of the creative city. And it's hard to think, it is a term that kind of Charles indicated earlier that now has a ubiquity. And Charles talked about it kind of being a kind of rash that spreads everywhere, really. But it's hard to think, actually, back in the 80s and 90s, it was something quite new. And I think there's a reason why it has spread so widely and been taken up in a number of different ways in lots of different places. And it's because it does, I think, tap into, whether you want to call it 2.0, 3.0, but something's going on. There is something going on as a kind of an urban creative age. And I mean, I think the clue again is in the name, in creative cities. So we are living in a period where cities are increasingly important, dramatic forms of urbanisation. But at the same time, this idea of creativity, I think, really kind of ties into what kind of how many cities operate now. So it's increasingly about kind of knowledge. It's increasingly about innovation. Lots of these kind of words that Charles was using. He talks about this being kind of the lifeblood. Elsewhere he talks about it being the kind of raw materials of contemporary city making. Now, what I like in particular about Charles's work is the way that this focus on the urban creative age isn't framed solely through kind of economic rationales, which can be the case with other approaches. I mean, obviously, yes, there is a lot about, we were talking today about kind of assets and costs and currencies and competition. So there is that sort of, economic language that runs through what Charles does. But also there's an emphasis on the social, on the ecological, on the religious, we heard this evening, on the civic, which is important term. So these different ways of thinking about what creativity is and also what it could be as well. Again, it's not only the kind of the obvious things, it's Charles was talking about the invisible, the incalculable, the intangible. And also it's not necessarily just about the kind of creative individual, which can again be something that frames a lot of this debate. It's also about the kind of organisations, the neighbourhoods, the communities as well. The collective intelligence is something which I'll mention at the end. Another thing that I really draw from Charles's work is, and I am a geographer, is the kind of the variety of examples that he gives. And we've obviously had a kind of a real sort of race through all these different cities in a very short period of time. But I think that's really important to get a sense of there is distinctiveness there. There's obviously some homogeneity as well. And I think that's really important. Certainly in the creative city, there's loads of examples. Almost every page has a sort of little box with an example. And I think also what's really interesting about this talk, it wasn't just the cities of North America and Europe. Also, Charles was talking about this kind of eastward shift. So we had Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, and Taiwan as well. But just to kind of flag a few thoughts about perhaps some of the. I put together a pamphlet a few years ago called "Creative City Limits," which you can find as a PDF online. So I just want to kind of pose a few kind of questions or more kind of, I guess, critical comments. And the first is, obviously this talk is framed around the kind of origins, and that's obviously fair enough because Charles invented the term, I think. But you hinted, I think, also at perhaps a longer history. So particularly through the work of Peter Hall. Sadly passed away last year. He was also at UCL. I think this is actually quite an interesting thing if you think about creative cities beyond Creative 1.0. And actually, how did it work then? And what can those historical perspectives say about what's going on now? And this, I do have a few students who've been talking about this on Monday. So I think what's quite interesting about that is when you look at the kind of archetypal creative cities of the past, often they were places that were quite revolutionary. So someone like Moscow in the 1920s well, they were quite kind of impoverished. I mean, someone like New York in the 1970s, often they were, we were deemed the kind of failures. And so what does that kind of say about the role for creativity? Because I think that this kind of leads into another kind of quick point I want to make, which is around this question of, I think sometimes the story is quite, I mean, it's great. I mean, it's not just optimistic one, kind of, quite a happy, kind of shiny, colourful, a lot of colour, colourful world. But cities aren't always like that. I mean, cities are also defined by kind of conflict and tensions and crisis, actually. So it's interesting, we had a quick shot of Athens there, but nothing more about actually what's going on in Athens at the moment. So a quick mention of gentrification and things like that. So not much more. And a quick mention of resistance as well, which was very interesting. But again, it's interesting to. I think this perhaps comes back to attention, and this is perhaps because I'm based in university, and I guess I come from more kind of critical urbanist tradition, and so this kind of creative consultants tend to, it's quite quite upbeat sort of can-do, I guess, agenda that they posit, which is, I guess, fair enough. But at the same time, you have critical urbanists who's everything kind of to do with creativity is somehow kind of connected into this neoliberal age. So, I mean, how can we perhaps work between the two? I mean, that's something I think I'm quite interested in. It's not all about kind of doom and gloom, but at the same time, it's not all about just kind of, colourful, shiny things. So this, I think, is very interesting what you're saying there at the end, Charles, just to finish off about, you were starting to have some interesting words like commons and empowerment and rights, which perhaps was slightly different to the earlier presentation. But then the Creative City Index that you finished with didn't really feature those at all, actually. And I would be very interested to think about actually, I mean, I have some problems with these sorts of indices and about how you sort of kind of create these hierarchies between different cities, and often I guess it is part of the kind of consultant's practice to kind of run different cities against each other. But perhaps, could we have a Creativity Index that actually took seriously things that generally don't get featured in them? So things like justice, or equality, or even things like how certain spaces are particularly kind of commodified or kind of left over, and they haven't been sort of taken over by big property, etc. Because actually, I think that might be, dare I say it, actually a more creative thing to do.
Thank you, Andrew.